starting the stream a little bit early. Just we'll wait a couple minutes before we begin the session, just in case there's a couple more joining. But I'll just want to make sure we get the stream started for anybody who's going to be watching online, and then we'll just kind of see where things go there. But yeah, hopefully all will work. We don't have Mel with us tonight. He's enjoying a well-deserved vacation, but we'll. I think he's got everything set up so foolproof that I shouldn't be able to destroy it. That's right. You press two buttons and you just let it go. Yes, or at least everybody who I have emailed for, I got all on email. Do you need us to send something to it, or? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I can certainly send that out to email list, and we can mention it on Sunday as well, and hopefully that will cover just about everybody. So. I saw that just before I left it. You sent that, but Laura reminded me, because we're doing the communion on Sunday with every other aisle, you only need 3 elders to do it that way. So we should be okay, because we've got 3 elders covered, and then they can just walk up and down the aisles and deliver, and 1 elder there, 2 elders, 3 elders there, and then Laura. When we've got the 4th elder is when we have 2 on that one aisle. So I think we should be okay with just who we've got. But okay, I think we're coming up to 7:30 here. So again, I'm gonna try, and if I have another coughing fit, hopefully I will cough in this general direction so I don't attack anybody. And God bless these fishermen's friends. Sure, if you could grab a little bit of water, that would be helpful. Thank you. Okay, well, let's well, welcome everybody who's watching online. Anybody who's watching online, welcome to our Bible study, our 3rd session. Again, we had to postpone our session last Wednesday because I was sick, and so we're going to bump it forward 1 extra week, just to make sure we cover all the 5 sessions. We'll go a little bit further into December than I had originally anticipated, but we'll make that work. So welcome. It's good to have everybody here tonight again, and we'll just kind of see how long my voice holds up for tonight, and go from there. So let's start with a word of prayer. Let's pray. Holy and loving God, thank you so much for this night. Thank you so much for each person who is gathered here, each person who is watching. We are gathered to hear your voice and to know you more, to know what you care about, and to know the things you want us to care about. And so we pray that you will speak to us through the words of Scripture as we look into the lives of these women in Jesus' family, that we will see your hand at work guiding them and your hand guiding us. We pray these things in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you very much. Feel that from you. Thank you. Okay, so it's been a couple weeks since we were together, and so we'll kind of go over where we've been and where we're going again, just to get everybody caught up. But we have been looking at these 5 women named in the Gospel of Matthew. We have Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Bathsheba. Joseph was the husband of Mary. Mary gave birth to Jesus. Those are those 5 women named in Matthew's Gospel. And so we wanted to look into this story of who are they, where did they come from, where did they why are they named in Matthew's gospel? What is so important about them? Why should we know their stories? And as we've seen so far, if you remember the story of Tamar and Rahab, they are not, the stories you would expect. They're not the nice, neat little, get good grades and try real hard and everything will work out fine. There's some mess to them and some trouble and some pain in those stories. And so I've been starting each time just with this kind of framework to kind of remind us of the story, how these 5 women fit into this really big story of the Old Testament. And so we started with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that when the people of Israel is one little family in one place. They go down to Egypt. There's slaves there. They come back out of Egypt, led through the Exodus and the return to the Promised Land under Moses and Joshua. And then we have the rule of the judges, this time of anarchy maybe is too strong of a word. Hi, Arda, welcome. But things are kind of very loosely governed groups of tribes working together during the time of the judges. And then the kingdom is established. You get the King Saul, King David, King Solomon, and the rest of David's descendants. And then finally, the kingdom falls, and we have the people are led off into exile and return. And then we get to Jesus and the New Testament. So just to kind of remind you of that framework so we know where all these things fit in. We know that Tamar was under the patriarchs. We know that Rahab was during that time of the Exodus and the return. And today we're going to talk about the judges. Today's story takes place during that time in between when the people have returned to the Promised Land, but they are but the kingdom has not been established. And so here's the story so far. We've talked about Tamar, and we've looked at how Tamar was a Canaanite. She's not a member of the people of Israel, as far as we know. She married into Judah's family. We know that Tamar is a widow. Her husband dies, and then she's sexually assaulted, raped by her brother-in-law, Onan, when he's supposed to be just getting her pregnant so that so that she has a future and has a family, and he takes advantage of that. And so she's on the margins of society. She's very vulnerable. She's relying on the goodwill of people like Judah and Judah's family, and they keep letting her down. And so she takes matters into her own hands, right? She puts her safety at risk to go out there to get justice, and she breaks the rules of what she's supposed to be doing to go out and get what she is owed, what the justice she deserves. And that is, again, a very similar story with Rahab. Rahab is also a Canaanite woman. Rahab is a prostitute living in Jericho. She's also someone on the margins of society, somebody who is, vulnerable in this world. And again, she puts her own safety at risk. The king demands information about where these spies are. She lies to the king. She hides the spies. She commits treason against her people in order to hopefully secure a future for her family, to protect these spies, and to give herself a place in that future society. So you can see there that there's a lot of similarities between these two women. They're both women who are, as we've noted here, they're courageous, they're shrewd, they're wily and clever. They, are not willing to just give up and say, that's it, it's over. They're willing to go the extra mile and do what needs to be done to make sure that what is right is done. And so that brings us to the story of the judges. And so to hear the story of Ruth, I think a lot of times when we read the story of Ruth, it's this kind of cute story, right? Of, Ruth and Naomi, this kind of gal pal sister thing. And it's easy to just kind of read it as this very light kind of story. And I think when you read it, again, in the way that we kind of present it because there aren't that many Bible stories that focus on women, and there are even less Bible stories that focus on women that are child appropriate. And so anytime there's a story that is even close to child appropriate about a woman, we immediately be like, okay, good, let's put that one in the kids' Bible because we need some women in there. And so, we kind of have this tendency especially with Ruth, to kind of gloss over the messy parts and make it all sweet and cute and light and fluffy, when it's really a really challenging story. And part of the reason it's so challenging is when this story happens. So Ruth starts, the first verse says, in the days when the judges ruled in Israel. That puts you right where this is. And if you look, Ruth, in the Christian Bible, Ruth comes right after Judges. Because, in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth is at the end of the Bible, with other books of kind of poetry and writing, but the Christians we moved Ruth back to set it right next to Judges. And I think that's, in a lot of ways, a good decision, because it highlights, when you see what happened in Judges and you see how bad things were in Judges, then you get a better sense of what's going on in Ruth. So when the people of Israel arrive in the Promised Land, they have been told, you need to keep your identity as God's people. You need to make sure that nothing changes the fact that you belong to God. And they immediately fall short on that. They immediately start falling away and living however they want, and things just start to go downhill. They go from bad to worse. And every time the people will rebel against God, they'll start living their own way, and disaster will come. They'll get invaded, they'll get taken over. They cry out for help. God sends a judge who comes in temporarily, leads them to victory. But the victory the judge always leads them to is a little less good than how they had it before. And then that pattern happens again. They go down, the judge comes back. They go down, the judge comes back. And it goes down and down and down and down. It's this kind of downward spiral all the way through the book. And the judges themselves get worse and worse. If you read through the book of Judges, they start out with pretty, reasonable people, and, they manage to lead fairly well. And by the end, you've got people like Samson, who's a complete scoundrel, and just kind of the best God can get at the moment. People like Jephthah they're not great judges. They're just the best God can do in this really dark time. And the reality is that as things are getting worse and worse and worse, descending into this kind of anarchy in Israel, those times are always hardest on the people who are most vulnerable, right? Which is true for us today, right? When trouble comes, it's the people who are on the margins that suffer. When there's war or a pandemic or a natural disaster hits, those are the things that, the people who have resources can manage to get through, but the people who are just getting by are the ones that really suffer. And that's what happens in Judges. In the last 2 chapters of Judges, I mentioned this a little bit last week, are some of the most heartbreaking and just grimly dark and awful chapters in the whole Bible. And if you, I don't recommend reading them because they're just really heartbreakingly awful. But the point is that this is how bad things have gotten. And particularly for women, there's just a story of women being attacked and abused and raped and murdered, and just one after the other, and war and genocide, and just everything is falling apart. And the point of those stories is that this is how bad things can get when people are only in it for themselves. There's this repeated verse throughout Judges that says, in those days there was no king. Everyone did what seemed right to them. That's the problem, is everyone's just saying, well, this is what I want to do. This seems right to me. I'm going to do it. And things get worse and worse and worse. And so if you are a woman in this era, you are vulnerable. If you are a widow, you are especially vulnerable. If you're a foreigner, you are vulnerable. All the, even the people who have all the resources and all the protections of society are vulnerable in this world. So the people who don't have those resources are especially vulnerable. And so that, you remember how bad things are in the time of the Judges, and then you read in Ruth that this story starts with, this is happening in the time of the Judges, the dark ages, the bad times, when things were really bad. That's when this story takes place. And this is a story about people who are vulnerable, who are right there on the edge of society. So, so I'm just going to kind of tell the story in chat, and if my voice gives out, I will take you up on that offer, Lynn, but hopefully we'll manage. So we're going to go through the book of Ruth, and I'm going to tell the kind of story and kind of try and summarize and not read all 4 chapters. But again, as you read and hear this story, what words would you use to describe Ruth? What does Ruth seem to care about? How is she similar to Tamar and Rahab? How are they different? And then there's this other character in this story that I think is worth thinking about, and that's Boaz. So what words would you use to describe Boaz? How does he compare with other men that we've seen in earlier stories? So that's our thing to think about here as we hear this story. So the story of Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges, and it starts with a woman named Naomi and her husband Elimelech. And Elimelech and Naomi have 2 sons, and they live in Bethlehem, and there is a famine that hits. And so they move out of the promised land. They move to the neighboring country of Moab, where they settle down to live out the famine. And while they're there, the 2 boys get married to 2 local women, Moabite women. And then they've been there for 10 years, and Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies, and the 2 sons both die. And so now Naomi is left as a widow, living in a foreign land, with no resources, no connections, only her 2 daughters-in-law to help. And so Naomi decides to go back to Bethlehem, basically to go back to die, right? She has no resources, she has no connections, she has no legal standing in the world to plead her case, to kind of advocate for herself. She's fairly elderly widow at this point. There's no hope of her marrying and having children. So her plan is basically she's going to go back to Bethlehem to at least die in her own country. And she tells her daughters, don't come with me, because if you come with me, you're going to die with me. That's essentially, I'm planning on going home to die. You come with me, you'll be in the same boat. You can stay back here, go back to your parents' house. They'll find you a new husband, somebody new to marry. You'll be okay, but don't worry about me. And there's this heartbreaking scene where, Naomi tells these girls to go back, and one of them does, recognizing that she's basically sending her mother-in-law to her death, but she goes home to have a future, to have a life, which you understand. But Ruth won't do it. Ruth will not leave Naomi. She insists that she's going to go back. And she says, wherever I go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. I mean, that's not just a hypothetical. That is literally what they are expecting is going to happen. So they go back to Bethlehem. And and Ruth decides that the way that they are going to survive is she is going to do the only real work that is available for a foreign widowed woman to do, which is to go and pick up the grain that's dropped on the ground when the reapers are bringing in the grain. Now, and again, this means you're going out of the city where there's a lot of people around and a lot of bustle. You're going out into the fields, and you're picking up the grain, and there's a certain amount of subterfuge because you don't know if the owner of that field is going to be happy about this. It says in the commands of the law that you are supposed to, when you harvest your grain, leave some of the stuff that falls for the poor. But a lot of people wouldn't follow that. They would double back and pick up every little shred of it to make sure they got all their profit. And so a lot of people could be, not very happy that there's poor people going through picking the stuff up that they wanted for themselves. And the reality is that, if you're out in the fields, you are far away from a crowd of people. If you are by yourself there, you are vulnerable. If you are a young woman going through the fields on your own, and one of the farmhands comes upon you, you could be in a lot of trouble. you could be killed, you could be raped, you could be, you could be very, very in danger. And so Ruth is putting herself in danger, but that's her only real option. She's vulnerable. She has to do this. And so she goes out to the field, and the field that she happens to go to is owned by a man named Boaz, who happens to be a relative of her father-in-law Elimelech. And so when she gets there and she starts harvesting, Boaz sees her there and says, "Who is that young woman? Who does she belong to?" They say, "She's the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She's been hard at work all morning except for a few minutes rest." So Boaz went to her and said, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. When you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. "What have I done to deserve such kindness?" she asked. "I am only a foreigner." And the word she uses for foreigner there is the same word that, you remember how Deuteronomy warned the people of Israel about these dangerous foreign women who are going to lead them astray and cause all sorts of trouble? That's the word she's talking about. I'm one of these troublesome Nakri, these women, these dangerous women that you've been warned about. Why are you being kind to me? I'm just a foreigner. But Boaz said, "Yes, I know, but I know what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I've heard how you left your father and mother. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done." And so Boaz is, recognizing the risk this woman is taking, recognizing her faithfulness to Naomi, and saying, God is going to be faithful to you too. So he protects her, right? He makes sure that his workers, he warns them, hands off, do not touch that woman. He puts his own personal seal of protection on her. He gives her extra food. He feeds her lunch, gives her water from the well. He makes sure she is protected, sends her home with this overflowing basket of grain back to Naomi. And Naomi is overwhelmed, stunned by this. "Where did you gather this grain today? Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you. The man I worked with today is named Boaz. He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers." Ruth said, "What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed." "Good," Naomi exclaimed. "Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you will be safe with him." So Ruth is vulnerable. She is in danger. She is just surviving by the skin of her teeth, and she hits the right field, and Boaz is kind to her and puts a hand of protection on her and ensures that she's going to be okay. And so all through the season, she keeps going. She brings that food back to Naomi. The two of them are provided for and survive. And then we get to chapter 3, if you're following along in your Bibles. And here is a very interesting scene and a very strange scene. Ruth at the threshing floor. So, Naomi says to Ruth, "My daughter, it's time that I find a permanent home for you so that you will be provided for. Ruth has been so kind. He's a close relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. Now do as I tell you. Take a bath, put on perfume, dress in your nicest clothes." Now again, Ruth and Naomi are like basically one level above homeless here. And so Ruth is like, get as dolled up as you can get for a woman that, does not have a lot of chances to get dolled up. Use whatever last drops of perfume are left in the bottle, get yourself decked out, go to the threshing floor. And the threshing floor is this time at the end of the season, all the grain has been gathered and it needs to be threshed so that the grain is divided from the chaff, and the grain can be safely stored for the winter. And it's a big celebration. It's a time where all the men get together and work through it. It's heavy work, but it's a lot of celebration, and there's feasting and drinking and celebrating like a Thanksgiving, really. It's the end of the harvest, right? And so there's a lot of rowdy camaraderie and partying at the threshing floor. And it's not probably a place nice women go, because it's, the men are all there drinking and rowdy and having a great time. So, go to the threshing floor, says Naomi. Don't let Boaz see you until he has finished eating and drinking. Be sure to notice where he lies down, then go and uncover his feet and lie down there. He will tell you what to do. Now, there are a few ways to read this story from this point on. There is the officially sanctioned Sunday school version, which is that what Naomi is telling Ruth to do is go and lie at Boaz's feet as a sign of submission, that you are under his protection and under his guidance, and saying, this is a symbolic gesture. That is one way to read it. The other way to read it is to understand that in Hebrew, the word feet can be a euphemism for the male genitalia. In the same way that we talk about balls or something like that, right? If we were writing this story and then 500 years later they said, Naomi told Ruth, go and play with his balls, we would understand what that means in a way that somebody 500 years, 2,000 years from now would be like, well, does Boaz have sporting equipment there? What's going on? Now, some people disagree with that interpretation. I think it's pretty clear what Naomi is trying to get Ruth to do. She has seen that Boaz is an honorable, generous man. And she knows that if Boaz were to get Ruth pregnant, he would do the right thing and marry her, whereas a lot of other men wouldn't. Boaz is probably the right guy, that if Ruth manages to seduce him and get pregnant, Boaz would feel obligated to care for her. And so Naomi's running a bit of a honeypot scheme here. Send in Ruth, get Boaz, who will be drunk, and he wakes up and his feet are uncovered, and assuming that nature will then take its course and things will progress. And again, Ruth was a married woman. She knows how the birds and the bees work here, right? She's not some innocent ingenue. She gets what's going on. And so there's a plan in place that she's going to go to the threshing floor and see this work. And again, kind of breaking some of the rules here, not exactly, this nice, neat little thing, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Naomi feels like this is the way to get this done. Ruth says, I will do everything you say. She went down to the threshing floor and followed the instructions of her mother-in-law. After Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, the Hebrew there was drunk, he lay down at the far end of the grain pile and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she replied. Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer. The Lord bless you, my daughter, Boaz exclaimed. You are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. Don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do what is necessary, for everyone in town knows you are a virtuous woman. But while it's true that I am one of your family redeemers, there is another man who is more closely related to you than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning I will talk to him. If he is willing to redeem you, very well, let him marry you. But if he is not willing, then as surely as the Lord lives, I will redeem myself. Lie down here until morning. So it is hard to overstate how much of a mensch Boaz is here, right? He wakes up drunk and finds Ruth there throwing herself at him. And he says, this is lovely and you're a wonderful woman, but technically there's somebody else who has a right to marry you first. And I'm not going to break the law, even here on the threshing floor. I'm not going to take advantage of you in any way if it means that, I wouldn't be following the law to do it. And so I promise you, I will figure out what needs to be done, and we will make it right. And then he lets her sleep and lets her sneak home in the morning without anybody seeing her. Boaz had said, no one must know that a woman is here at the threshing floor. He measures 6 scoops of barley into her cloak, placed it on her back, and they return to town. So he does not take advantage of Ruth in her vulnerability, in her desperation. He provides for her again, sends her home, tells the whole story to Naomi, and Naomi says, well, let's see what happens. This man won't rest until he has settled things today. So Boaz went to the town gate and took a seat there, and then the family redeemer he had mentioned came by. And so again, you remember that story from Tamar, that there's this ritual in place, this tradition in place, that if a woman dies and doesn't have offspring, a family member is supposed to take that person into their family and provide for them. And it's supposed to be an orderly thing. The next person is supposed to do it. So the family redeemer should be the one to do it, but the family redeemer hasn't done it yet. They've just been letting Naomi and Ruth suffer, and they're just waiting and not acting. And Boaz goes in front of the whole town and calls this guy out on it in a very clever way. Calls them out and says, hey, Naomi, she has this piece of land. She's not legally able to do anything with it other than pass it on to this one family member who has first right of refusal. Do you want to buy the land? The man's on the spot. He says, sure. And Boaz says, oh, okay, great. But if you buy the land, you then need to marry Ruth, this Moabite woman. And all of a sudden the guy's like, no, I don't want to do that. Don't have anything to do with Ruth. And again, Moabite women, foreign women, are trouble. Maybe this guy doesn't want anything to do with this foreign woman. Maybe this guy doesn't want the stigma of being associated with a Moabite. He doesn't explain why he won't do it. But as soon as he turns that down, that opens up the door for Boaz to marry Ruth and to bring her into her family and to redeem her and Naomi into the family. And so Boaz said to the elders, to the crowd standing around, you are witnesses today. I've bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon, and with the land I have acquired Ruth, the Moabite widow of Mahlon, to be my wife. This way she can have a son to carry on the family name of her dead husband and to inherit the family property here in his hometown. You are all witnesses today. Then the elders and all the people standing in the gate replied, we are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, from whom all the nation of Israel descended. May you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. And may the Lord give you descendants by this young woman who will be like those of our ancestor Perez, the son of Tamar and Judah. And I don't think it's an accident that they mentioned Tamar, right? I don't think they just happened to throw her name in there. The crowd and the author of Ruth is deliberately drawing attention to the fact that, there's a long history in this family of women who have had to do desperate things to survive and who God has blessed and provided for and sheltered and protected all the way through. And so Boaz brings Ruth into his family. They get married. Ruth gets pregnant, has a son. They name the son Obed. Obed became the father of Jesse and the grandfather of King David. And the whole family continues down on towards Jesus. So, this is a wonderful story. And it's, it's this incredible, the Boaz and Ruth, it's a lovely love story. It's, again, Boaz is one of the greatest heroes in the Bible, as far as I'm concerned. One of the only heroes, frankly. Just about the rest of the characters, you name any of them, David, Abraham, Moses, they all mess up in some spectacular way. Boaz is just heart of gold, pure, straight through. And it deliberately, draws attention to, this is a Moabite woman, this is a foreigner, at a time when, again, according to the book of Deuteronomy, it said a Moabite cannot be a member of the people of Israel. A Moabite's descendants to the 10th generation cannot be a member of the people of Israel. And then you see King David, the greatest Israelite who has ever lived, was, a great-grandchild of a Moabite woman. So this book is making a very clear argument about who gets welcomed into this community of Israel, who finds a place, because the should-be, would-be family redeemer fails to do what he should have done to protect Ruth, to protect Naomi, to give them a home and a future. And maybe it's out of, this kind of xenophobia for this Moabite woman, because he seems to withdraw from that, and Boaz doesn't. And I think there's a reason for that. We talked, when we talked about Judah, right? Judah was a terrible father, right? Terrible, terrible children. Nobody, the apple doesn't fall from the tree, far from the tree. Judah's sons are just a mess. You remember who Boaz's parents are? You remember who Boaz's parents are in the genealogy? Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. So Boaz knows what it's like to be vulnerable, because his mother was a prostitute. His mother was a foreign woman. His mother was somebody who was welcomed into the people of Israel. And you wonder, Boaz is a wealthy man, but he's not married. He's an older man, and he doesn't have a wife. And you wonder, has he been not able to find a wife because his mother is Rahab? I don't know. But you get in this story, the story of this community that is kind of xenophobic, kind of hostile towards foreigners, and you get the one person in there who decides to provide for this foreign woman, this vulnerable woman, who protects her and guards her, and even when she's desperately throwing himself at her, he does what is right for her. And you know that, he probably remembers what his mother had experienced. He clearly has learned something about what it is like to be a woman who is vulnerable, who is exposed to danger in the world. So that brings us, to Ruth and these questions here. What words do you want to use to describe Ruth in this book? Loyal. Yeah. Faithful and loyal. Yeah. Industrious, caring. Yeah. She's like a hard worker, right? She's out there in the fields every day, dawn to dusk, picking up this, hard work, just gathering whatever's dropped from the people, right? That is a difficult job. What else? Sorry? Yeah. Yeah. She, her love for Naomi is so strong. She's willing to die for Naomi. She's expecting to die with Naomi. That is not just a theoretical, hypothetical thing. She is expecting that, she is going to go down, and that loyalty and that faithfulness is incredible. And that just, she trusts, she puts herself in danger every single day going out to the fields for Naomi's sake. And when she goes to the threshing floor, she is trusting that Naomi's got her best interests here, and that Boaz, is the guy that he has represented himself to be. Because again, she is incredibly, incredibly vulnerable there. If she disappears, nobody is going to care. Nobody is going to notice. She is really just trusting that this is going to work, that this plan is going to come through. Yeah, she is very, very. Naomi seems to be the brains of the operation in some ways, in that, but Ruth has to be wily enough to pull it off. I mean, you say she's submissive. It takes a certain amount of moxie to sneak into the threshing floor party, take a drunk man's pants off, and, this is not, well, there was probably a less of a zipper to fiddle with, sure. I mean, there's robes and flowing garments and whatever else. But nevertheless, logistically is not the issue. It's, it takes a certain amount of courage to do that. And so, yes, she is really, really trusting and loyal and submissive to Naomi, that Naomi says, do this, it's a good idea. She's like, all right, I'm going to do it. But she's, that doesn't mean she's a pushover, right? It does not mean that she's, a mark. There's a courage and a spine there that is impressive. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a calculated gambit, but they're going off of the evidence they've got that Boaz is a good guy, that Boaz is not going to hurt them. And that the whole thing relies on that they're hoping, they can get Boaz to take care of them. The plan relies on that to work. But, it's still a risk, right? Because anybody else finds her on the way into the threshing floor. Anybody else meets her, if she's uncovered, like if something goes wrong, it's still a really dangerous place for her to be. Again, Boaz has told his workers, do not touch her, but you're going into a rowdy party with these drunk farm workers, and suddenly, a young woman shows up. They may not listen to what Boaz told them to do. So she's still putting herself out there, but it's all reliant on that trust, and that, we're trusting that Boaz is going to keep his word, is going to be faithful. And Boaz turns out to be more faithful than they had even anticipated. More of a mensch and a solid gold saint than they had even anticipated. Are there anything else about Ruth? What does she care about? Yeah. Again, that loyalty to Naomi is breathtaking. Yeah, because she knew that Naomi's only hope was for her to stay, right? If Ruth leaves and Orpah leaves, the two daughters-in-law, if they both go back to Moab, Naomi can't be out there in the fields gleaning the grain all day long. Naomi can't, do the same thing that Ruth ends up doing. So Naomi would have gone back and just died in her hometown, surrounded by people she knew, her friends, and but she wouldn't have been able to provide for her, and nobody else would have done it for her, and that would have been it. And Ruth puts her life on the line in order to give Naomi this glimmer of hope for a future. And so that family that she is, she cares about Naomi. She cares that this is going to be, this is something worth my life to protect this one. Yeah. Yeah, and that Boaz is, believes that, she is doing him a favor, right? Which again, Boaz is, maybe selling himself a little short there, but he is, believing, and he recognizes her faithfulness. He recognizes her kindness to Naomi, and says, you are being just as kind to me by, by wanting to have anything to do with it. And again, you get the sense that Boaz has not been, he's clearly well off in the town, but he has no family, he has no spouse, and just being greeted by Ruth, he seems to think she is being, doing a kindness to him. And so maybe he has been ostracized because of his family, because of his history. Yeah. 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 And yeah, her, her faithfulness to Naomi becomes faithfulness to God. And that's how Boaz sees it too, right? He says, may God, shelter you under his wings. May God protect you because of the faithfulness that you've shown to Naomi. That, by doing this action, by taking on this, joining yourself so closely to Naomi, God sees that as an act of worship, as an act of faithfulness to God. That it is, and you think of, many years later when Jesus says, whatever you did to the least of my brothers and sisters, you did to me. That's what is happening here, right? Whatever you did to Naomi, the least of one of the least of my sisters, God counts that as an act of kindness towards God, an act of devotion and loyalty and faithfulness to God. And it becomes an act of worship by Ruth to be so faithful, to give up her life for this faint chance that Naomi might make it. Yeah, and that's the irony here, again, is that Ruth, the Moabite, is the most faithful follower of God in this whole story, right? And when in a time when the whole world is falling apart, when the people of Israel are just throwing themselves, their lives away, their world away, chasing after all this other stuff, and being completely failing to be the people they're meant to be. And here is Ruth and Boaz, these two, the daughter of Moab and the son of a prostitute, and they are together as these paragons of virtue, right? These paragons of the way what God wants the people to be, and it's a wonderful thing to realize that they get it. And God rewards that, and God blesses that because of their faithfulness to each other and to him. And yeah, I mean, I asked that question about, Boaz, because again, I think Boaz is one of the purely heroic characters in the Bible. And certainly in the Old Testament, it's Boaz, maybe Daniel's got an outside shot at it, but the rest of them are, all the Bible has a lot of scoundrels with a heart of gold, or screw ups who barely just kind of made right, kind of that God is just kind of dragging them along, kicking and screaming, you're going to do my work whether you like it or not. Most of the heroes of the Bible are like that. Boaz is just straight heroic. Sorry? Yes, and it is the story of Ruth. It's the story of Ruth and Boaz. They are both, again, I think they are people who are both on the margins of society in some ways. But Boaz has a much more comfortable place on the margins. He's got his wealth, he's got his crops, he's got his fields. He's well situated, even if doesn't seem to be the most popular guy in town. Whereas Ruth is right at the bottom, right at the vulnerable, and yet Boaz sees her as a faithful follower of God, despite her background, despite her parentage, despite her nationality. Boaz sees her as someone who's faithfully following God, and he shows her that same faithfulness. So, yeah, yeah, oh yeah. I mean, Boaz is, again, Boaz is an older guy, drunk, out at a party, wakes up, there's a beautiful woman there throwing himself, and his pants are gone, or robes, or whatever you want to say. Again, this is and his reaction is, oh, well, actually, technically, the law says that somebody else is, got first tips here. So, like, he is, he is he's an older guy, and he clearly sees Ruth as the catch here. He clearly sees, you're doing me a favor by even talking to me. Despite all the blessings he's done for her, there's this humility there. And again, this kind of sense of, there's no, presumption. There's no arrogance there. There's no, oh yeah, I'll do this out of the goodness of my heart because I'm such a great guy. There's this great humility there in everything Boaz does. Yeah. Yeah, because he knows that if he sleeps with her that night on the threshing floor, and word gets out back in this town, the other guy who has the first right can say, oh, well, this woman has broken the law, you've broken the law, therefore, I get the property, and they've broken the law, so they're out. Like, there's a reason he wants to follow the law and go through the legalistic routes. He wants to make sure that everything is done just in the right way, because if it's not, that is making Ruth even more vulnerable. That's making Ruth even more exposed to danger. And so he does not want to let anything endanger this relationship he wants to have with her. He's clearly smitten, obviously. He's clearly wants this to happen, but he does not want to put her in any more peril, in any more danger than she's already in. So let's do it by the book for sure. But he does that, again, guided out of his love for this, and he goes beyond the law in many ways. Again, the law says, let the poor people come and glean from your fields and pick up the stuff that you've dropped. He goes way beyond that. He's getting them to leave extra behind. He's giving her lunch. He's giving her food. She's bringing in more than she could ever have imagined, if she's just picking up the extras. He goes and he follows the law, and then he goes that extra step beyond to make sure that she's provided. Yeah. Yeah. You broke one little rule, that's it. Stone her. Put her to death. Yeah. Yeah. And again, you look at Tamar, you look at Boaz and you compare him with his ancestor Judah, there is no comparison here, right? Boaz is, a saint, and Judah is not. Sorry? Yeah. And that, and Judah, again, has this upright standing, this pillar of the community. I am the leader of the nation. I am the leader of the family. I always do what's right. Meanwhile, he's not. He's left his daughter-in-law to twist in the wind and not provided for her safety and her future. And yet, Boaz seems to be this kind of ostracized figure in the community who doesn't have the same kind of standing and everything that Judah has. And yet, Boaz follows the law to the letter when it matters, when it makes a difference to save this woman, to help her. He goes and does everything he needs to do to make sure it's done right. So nobody can question, nobody can quibble. She's brought into the family, and she's welcomed by the community. There's this outpouring of welcome at the end there. that they say, yeah, okay. And they remember, right? They remember Tamar. They remember that story. They say, oh yeah, okay, we can welcome her. We can bring her into the community now. Now she's a descendant. She's just like Tamar. She's part of the family. Again, didn't quite follow the rules in exactly the way they were supposed to be lined up, but she did what was necessary to provide for Naomi and for her own future. Yep. Yep. Yeah, and I mean that's one of the tragedies of the Old Testament. I mean, and of just human nature is, yeah, like there are so many of these, that as soon as they're blessed by God, they immediately start thinking, look at all this stuff I did, look at all this stuff I got, and they forget. David forgets where he comes from. I mean, we're going to talk about Bathsheba next week, but there's that sense of forgetting that you were on the bottom and God lifted you up and thinking, I made it here myself. And Boaz doesn't do that. Boaz remembers where he came from. Boaz remembers where his mom came from, right? Because the last time we saw Rahab in the book of Joshua, she was brought into the nation, but they kept her at a distance. They said they brought her and her family into the nation, but they said they kept her outside of the camp. There was still this sense, again, of distance, of ostracizing, of we'll protect you because we promised, but we're not really sure about you. And now we see that, well, she's married into the tribe of Judah. She found a husband, but that husband's son is still unmarried, and as an older guy. So there's a lot of questions going on about, has this community really welcomed in Rahab? And now Boaz, who has experienced that in his own life, now welcomes in Ruth and welcomes her into the family and finds a place for her to provide for her. And again, from the perspective of the writer of this book, that is essential for the future of the people of Israel, because that leads to King David, the greatest hero that the people of Israel will ever have, would not have lived without Ruth and Rahab and Tamar. And they're all in this story. They mentioned they mentioned Tamar. They talk about, Boaz's, Perez, and they've got the another little glimpse of the ancestry there at the end of Ruth. So yeah, again, with Ruth, again, we have another foreign woman. With Tamar and Rahab, both foreign women, not one of God's people at the beginning of this story. We have another widow. Like Tamar, she's widowed. Her husband has died. She has somebody who risks her safety and her future for the sake of someone else. Out of faithfulness to Naomi, she puts her own life at risk. She could have gone back to Moab, had an easy, comfortable life, gotten married again, had lots of children, not worried about Naomi dying alone in Bethlehem. And yet, she again, she breaks some rules in order to see that happen. She, with Naomi's encouragement and direction, yes, but again, Ruth is not just a pushover here. She does a lot of the dirty work. Ruth, Naomi comes up with the plan, but she puts herself out there and puts herself at risk. Every day she goes out to those fields, she's taking on some risk, and especially going to the threshing floor, she's putting herself at risk. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and to for her own sake and for Naomi's sake. But yeah, she's like, that's the life she chose when she decided to stick with Naomi, is choosing that daily risk, that daily vulnerability in this really dangerous society. Yeah, Lynn. Yeah. 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 And Boaz is the one guy who gets that, right? Who sees that, you can't just pick and choose what you want out of this, right? The other guy wants the land, right? Of course he wants the land, because the land doesn't come with any complications. Yeah. And yet Boaz wants the complications. The land is not what he's interested in. He wants to marry Ruth, and he wants to provide for Naomi because he's already been providing for them. He's already been blessing them. But Boaz is the one who will follow all of the law and take all of that on in the same way that Naomi or that Ruth took that on by staying with Naomi, right? By saying, I will stay with you and care with you and risk my life for you. And Boaz then extends that same offer of protection and grace to Ruth and therefore to Naomi. So that, and the end of the story, it ends with this lovely scene of, at the beginning when Naomi first comes back to Bethlehem, she says, "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara," which means bitter. I'm this worn out, dried up husk. Got nothing left. I'm just bitter. But it ends with Naomi, with Ruth giving birth to a son, and Naomi took the baby and cuddled him to her breast, and she cared for him as if he were her own. The neighbor woman said, "Now at last Naomi has a son again." So you get this lovely picture of this woman who was convinced she had nothing to live for because she was right, because the whole world had conspired against her to take away everything, and she felt she had no hope. And again, the law of God was meant to provide hope for people in that situation. The law was there so that nobody would ever feel that hopeless. And because people weren't following the law, they were letting these people slip through the cracks. And then you get, Boaz, who, follows the law to the letter because he's legalistic in the best possible way, because the law is supposed to be life-giving when we follow it. It's supposed to be something that, when you follow it, it means, provide for the widows and the orphans and the people who are on the margins. Take care of these people because they matter. And when you are caring for them, you are caring for God. You are being faithful to God in how you are faithful to the people like Ruth and Naomi. And when you read through the book of Judges, you see how far short of that standard the people of Israel are following. And then you read this story and see what it is meant to be when we follow the law, when we follow God's guidance for us. Any other thoughts on that story? Any other questions or Well, I just that was mostly just an opportunity to take a shot at Judah. That question was strictly there just for us to comment again about what a jerk Judah is. There aren't really, we haven't got to David yet. Again, next week we will see that David, of his two ancestors, he much more resembles Judah than Boaz. But Boaz, and again, Boaz, I don't think there is really another figure in the Old Testament who follows the law so faithfully and again in the best light. We have this idea that following the law is this kind of, no, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do this. And this is, seeing the law as life-giving, as following God's guidance that brings us to, to freedom and to joy by providing for the people who need it. And again, this story is, it's this picture of this, this glorious, beautiful scene of two people, caring for each other, with Naomi and Ruth first, and then Ruth and Boaz. These people, vulnerable people who are caring for each other, who are, lifting each other up, providing for each other in the midst of a really difficult, troubling time. And that is what following the law is about. That's what we're meant to do. Yeah. 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 Yes. Yeah. Yeah. He is like the entire time throughout his care for Ruth and Naomi is like right at the front. And again, I don't think that's an accident that Rahab was his mom. I think she, was a much better parent than Judah was for his, messed up boys, because he, Boaz clearly knows, and sees these women and cares about them and protects them, in a way that I'm sure he learned from his mom. That seems so clear to me that he is, has known what it's like to be rejected, to be ostracized, to be vulnerable, and he's acting to protect them. Yeah. Oh, sorry. But so the other thing to think about with Ruth, and just as a kind of a closing comment remark, Ruth, we think, was written after the time of Judges. It's not part of the Deuteronomistic history that we talked about last week, right? The Deuteronomistic history tells this story of, the people of Israel coming into the promised land, all this promises, all the law that they were supposed to follow, all the good things they were supposed to do, and then they fall short of that, everything falls apart, goes downhill until the exile. We think that history was written during the exile by people looking back over the history and saying, look, this is all the ways we fell short. This is all the trouble we got into. And again, there are glimpses like the story of Rahab in that, of this kind of minority voice saying, it's not every foreign woman is necessarily a troublemaker and an evil thing, but mostly in the Deuteronomistic history, that is the case, that foreign women cause trouble. And so when the people came back from exile and they were realizing they had a second chance now to take care of the people, to take care of the land God had given them, they were back, they wanted to rebuild, restart, and they went back and they looked at this history and they said, okay, look at the trouble that foreign women have gotten us into. Look at the trouble, and we need to do something about this. And so you look at the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and one of the things they did was tell all the people, anyone who's married a foreign woman, you need to divorce them and send them away. Abandon your wives and your children. If you married somebody who's not a member of the house of Israel, they need to be cast out. And that's how the book of Ezra ends, is with this brutal scene of all the men who have married foreign women sending their wives and their children away, presumably to just die, to provide for themselves somehow, but to abandon them. And so, and at that time, again, you have this recommitment that the people are saying, let's recommit ourselves to what, to avoid the mistakes our ancestors meant, we need to get rid of these foreign women. And that's when we think that the book of Ruth was written. That's when we think that Ruth was written as an answer, as again, that minority voice. And you see that again in Isaiah. Part of Isaiah was written around the same time, where it says, don't send the foreigner away. Don't say that the foreigner can't be part of the people of Israel. And you have this story of Ruth saying, don't forget that the most faithful, holy, loving people in the whole time of the Judges, the people who were these, following the law of God to the best of their ability and loving each other, and it was Ruth and Boaz. It was these two people who, by the laws of Deuteronomy, would be considered outcasts. The son of a Canaanite and the daughter of Moab. That those should be, considered outcasts when they are the only people in this story who are following God's law and who have become part of the people of Israel. And so there's this counterpoint to that desire to let's get rid of these foreigners. There is this voice of, no. Ruth was a foreigner. David's grandma was a foreigner. Boaz's mom was a foreigner. And this celebration of that history, that celebration of Tamar, and that story that's been happening again is being woven into this story as a reminder of the role that it's not just being a descendant of Abraham that makes you God's people. It's people who are ready to be faithful and to follow. And when you show that faithfulness to the vulnerable, to the people on the margins, the people who are at the bottom, when you show that faithfulness to them, you are being faithful to God. You are becoming one of God's people. And so far from sending the people out into the cold, those are the people we need to be serving and welcoming and loving. Yeah. So yeah, in Judaism, Judaism is inherited on the mom's side, and so my understanding of it is that if your mom is Jewish, you are considered Jewish, um, and so there's still that kind of tradition of you know there we need to make sure that we marry a good Jewish girl and settle down and have a family. That is still and again, for the Jewish people who have survived as a people for 2,000 years against all odds, right? Like you don't hear a lot of stories today about what the Moabites are up to, because the Moabites have just disintegrated into the sands of history. The Jewish people have survived, and they've done that by being really careful about marking out this is who we are as a people. We are God's people. We have these markers. We have these ways of making sure, and that is like I get that, right? That has served them well. But there's that question then of Ruth is again that little bit of a counter story, a little bit of a push in that balance, and it's a minority voice. And again, this is part of the Hebrew scriptures too for the people of Israel, for Jewish people. This is part of their story. And as Christians, we read that and we can kind of read into that, and we see ourselves as Gentiles who have been joined on to the family of Abraham. And we remember that we are lucky to be here, right? We are lucky to be part of God's people. We are here by grace, right? And so but that we are welcome. That there is a way, even here in Ruth, you can see that way that God is welcoming the outcasts, God is welcoming the foreigners, God is welcoming the people who don't quite fit. And that gets, again, there's a reason why Matthew tells this story and includes these women's name, right? Because Matthew is going to be telling a particular story about who Jesus is, and it matters in that story that this history of God's welcome for the foreigner and the outcast keeps coming up again and again and again, right? Because there's this bad habit that Christians we sometimes fall into, where we make the Jews the bad guys and the Christians the good guys. The Old Testament is all doom and gloom, and the New Testament is, yeah, hooray, Jesus. And what Matthew is doing by putting these women in there is saying, this isn't a new story. We're telling the same story that's always been being told. It's all the way through there. We just are making sure you notice it, because there's a human tendency when we hear that story to fall into, but I want to make my story all about me and people who are like me. We all do that. And it's easy to forget those examples of Tamar and Rahab and Ruth, that, again, that's always been God's story. That's always been that line through the Old Testament and into the New. And Matthew is saying that for a reason, to draw us back so that we see those stories and how they fit, that it's always been, God working through. Yeah. 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 Oh, yeah. 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 Oh, yeah. I mean, it is really easy to read this story of Ruth and put it in a modern context. And it would not we like to think, oh, we are so much more enlightened and so much, but a woman on her own in the streets in Toronto would be just as vulnerable as Ruth is here, right? You think of, going and like a homeless woman going to an executive's home or executive building and trying to be the cleaning lady, and just cleaning up, how vulnerable that would be to somebody taking advantage of her. In our world just as much as in this world, right? Like, it is not hard, to see. And again, you read this Judah and Tamar, like, Judah is a very understandable figure, that pompous, outwardly holy and pious person who turns out to be, kind of a windbag, and a hypocrite. That's a figure we would see very, very well, right? And so we can be just as xenophobic and just as mistrustful of outsiders. We can be, there's still all the talk about building walls and all the other stuff. We are very quick to to doubt that foreigners and immigrants and people like that can contribute to our society. And so yeah, the story of Ruth, when you consider how not all that much has changed, and yet God is still calling us to care for these folks, and that has always been the same story. The surroundings, the setting, the context has changed, but God's call to be faithful, to protect these people who need protection, to bring justice to those people who need that justice, that story does not change. And it's the same all the way through. And we're going all the way through the Old Testament, really, from all the way through this history, and it keeps being the same story again and again. That these are the people that, again, Matthew is drawing our attention to throughout that family, to say this is worth paying attention to, because this connects with what Jesus wants us to know, because this connects with who Jesus is. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of reasons for, different societies have different rules on how doing things. If you go, if you pass on things through the women's side, there's just a lot less worry about, is this really exactly whose father is this person, right? You don't have all the kind of trouble with that the British monarchy seems to have, where random whose king exactly is this, and so it makes perfect sense to do it that way. I think, it puts this. Deuteronomy has reasons for worrying about foreign women, and there's the story of Solomon and the story of Ahab, and there's lots of examples of the trouble that you can get into. But there's these counterexamples too, and that's the thing that Ruth's story is, I think, meant to be a balance against that kind of worry and that kind of blanket prohibition of this is always trouble, stay away. That Ruth is saying, no, don't just cover all of this with this one judgment, because if you do that, you're missing out on Ruth too. Well, and there is also, again, a very human thing to put the blame for everything on the women in the situation, right? Whenever somebody, any politician gets caught in a sex scandal, they're usually like, oh well, it's the woman's fault. It's, they're trying to kind of put it all on, this. It's never, men are really, really good at outsourcing the blame for our misconduct, right? And finding some way out of it. And that's a long, long history in any way of the, I would have been perfectly virtuous and, but this, she seduced me, it was all her fault. And that's, you can see that kind of thing in the Deuteronomistic history of, certainly Solomon would have been a great guy, but he got all these wives who caused him trouble. Samson would have been a good judge, but Delilah kept causing him trouble. You get these kind of examples throughout that. And Yeah, that putting the blame on, well, yeah, and Adam right away is like, she gave me the fruit, it was her fault, right? Right away, blame the woman, blame the woman. That's right from the beginning. Well, right, and this is why Boaz is such a paragon of virtue, because any man who is like, well, I couldn't help it, she threw herself in, oh, Boaz could help it. Boaz was pantsless, drunk, with a very eager lady, and he's like, whoa, 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 let's get everything all signed up before we do this. Like, that is, so that undercuts every other guy's excuse for the rest of your life. If Boaz can do it, you have no excuse, because Boaz, yeah, is as good a man as you can ask for in the whole Bible. And again, it is never, he never puts it as, Ruth is a troublemaker, Ruth is causing me. He sees everything she does, even this action of, seduction, is uncovering his feet, is seen as, he sees that as an act of generosity and care, and this is a generous, loving thing you've done for me, but you can't do this yet. I mean, he's seeing her. She's proposing marriage, which is not typically the way you go about doing it. But again, rules are rules, and you see that, again, that Boaz being legalistic in the best possible way, the rule follower in the best possible way, and all the women in these stories have been rule breakers in the best possible ways, right? Going outside of the rules when they're an obstacle to justice. And you see with Boaz that the rules become an instrument of justice. The rules become a way to defend the people who are poor, the people who are marginal. Yeah. and and again, that, yeah, that tendency to, to hold everybody else responsible but me. And that's what we saw with Judah and Tamar again, right? When both Judah's sons were scoundrels, and Onan had both, so outraged God that God had them put them to death. And Judah assumes this is Tamar's fault. I don't want to give you my third son because you'll kill him too, right? That's Judah he is immediately saying this is all her fault. And that tendency to put the blame on the woman is right there. And Boaz, God bless him, will not do that. And again, those are the ones who are being vulnerable and putting themselves in danger. Whereas, yeah, yeah, Kathy. Okay. Yeah. So, and okay, cool. Yeah. 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 And Boaz has been seen as a kind of a Christ figure in, for Christians reading this story, that title, he's called the family redeemer, the kinsman redeemer. And that by buying the land, he's redeeming Naomi and Ruth and rescuing them, and sacrificing himself to save them. And that idea of the kinsman redeemer, the family redeemer, is, seen in some ways as this kind of forerunner for what Jesus does, in saving us, in buying us back, and there's a lot of language in the church about, the relationship between Jesus and the church, as Jesus as the church is the bride of Christ. Have you ever heard that? The idea of, we were lost and, alone, and God bought us and brought us in. And that's, there's a lot of language throughout the Old Testament of Israel as God's bride, that Israel is brought, God found Israel and brought her in and married her, and it's usually in the language in the prophets as Israel is the unfaithful wife, right? The wife who God has blessed and taken care of, and then the wife has run away. And again, that, when you just use that metaphor too much, it gets very anti-women and very kind of mean in some ways, if that's the only metaphor you're ever using. But when you see that metaphor in a good light, and that relationship between God and Jesus and the church, you see that as, this is the kinsman redeemer who has brought us into the family and rescued us and given us a home and a place. And that's what Boaz is meant to be seen as this one who rescues and provides for Ruth and for Naomi, and who follows the law in doing it. Yeah, last thoughts here, yeah. It does not. So we know that their son is named Obed, and Obed's son is named Jesse, and Jesse's son is named David. We don't get any more story about Obed. Jesse we meet in the next book in 1 Samuel as the father of a whole bunch of boys, of which David is the youngest. And we get a lot of stories about David. But somewhere in between Boaz and David, Boaz's family lessons, and again, David starts out okay, starts out great, and just, doesn't quite, the power and the wealth and, that they get to. And that's what we're going to talk about next week when we get our last Old Testament woman, which is Bathsheba. Okay, so let's we'll end there, and we'll again next Wednesday we'll tackle the story of Bathsheba. But for now, let's close in prayer. Let's pray. Holy and loving God, thank you so much for this night. Thank you so much for the story of Ruth and Boaz, for their faithfulness to each other, their faithfulness to you. Father, thank you that all throughout the Bible we see your story of welcoming the least of our brothers and sisters, welcoming the vulnerable and the outcast. Thank you that when we welcome them, we are welcoming you. We are being faithful to you. And so we pray that we will open our eyes to see the people in our communities, the people who are vulnerable all around us, that we will show the same devotion and faithfulness that Ruth and Boaz showed, that their love for each other and for you will be lived out in our love each and every day. We pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to go and deconnect the stream. Thanks, everybody who's watching online. I hope that worked, because Mel's not here, and I might just be talking to air this whole time, but hopefully that's okay.